Well, it's a great privilege here in Bali to be able to welcome Dr. Jim Kim and Madame Christine Lagarde to address us. I think it's the first time that they've been to address us at the annual meetings, and we feel that's a great privilege, and thank you for your time. The way we're going to do this is Dr. Kim and Madame Lagarde are going to speak first, and then we're going to open it for questions. Now, I want to take as many questions as we possibly can, which means that colleagues will have to be very brief and ask one short question, and I will take 4 or 5 at once. But I hope if we do that, we can get questions from everybody who wants to ask a question, or as many as possible. So without further ado, can I welcome Dr. Kim to address us? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Members of Parliament, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here and welcome to this high-level parliamentary meeting. I want to thank especially our friend Jeremy, who we've been working with for such a long time. It's for 6 years for me. I want to first express our sincere gratitude to Indonesia for hosting these meetings. 34,000 people will be participating over the next week. And also to express our condolences. We're deeply saddened by the terrible loss of life in Sulawesi, and we know that this is a very difficult time for Indonesians. We want to make clear that we stand by the people of Indonesia and are committed to helping in the recovery and rebuilding efforts after the devastation caused by the earthquake and tsunami, including the earthquake in Lombok nearby. We want to ensure that this resilient country continues its upward economic trajectory and that all Indonesians have access to the best economic opportunities. By being here in Bali, we hope to demonstrate the importance of the international community and multilateralism coming together to support the people of Indonesia, and we've been assured that the World Bank Group IMF annual meetings will in no way take away from resources from or otherwise adversely impact the urgent recovery and rebuilding work that's underway. As parliamentarians, you make decisions day in and day out that determine the fate of your countries and your constituents. My friends in electoral politics remind me that it's a tough job. Your constituents demand results, and when they don't get them, they know where you live. I'd like to, though, discuss a topic that you'll be hearing a lot about this week: making sure that we prepare our people, our economies, and our societies for a dramatically evolving future. If we don't, we have no chance to achieve our goals of ending extreme poverty and boosting shared prosperity. We're making progress toward those goals, but our biannual Poverty and Shared Prosperity report, which we'll release next week, found that poverty remains stubbornly higher in low-income countries, and the rate of poverty reduction is slowing. If we're going to achieve our goal of ending extreme poverty, reducing the poverty rate to 3% by 2030, which is the goal, many developing countries will have to go at rates that are far faster than they have in recent decades. And as we move closer to eliminating poverty, the remaining poor will be harder and harder to reach. We estimate that by 2030, 46% of people living in extreme poverty will live in countries suffering from fragility, conflict, and violence. That leaves us with a tough question. How can we adapt to these mounting challenges, accelerate the fight against poverty, and help countries prepare their people for the future? We're focusing on several of these issues here in Bali this week. The first area of focus is to boost inclusive, sustainable economic growth by helping countries manage their debt levels and harness technology with the Bali FinTech agenda that we're working on in very close collaboration with Madame Lagarde and the IMF. The second issue that we're focusing on is building resilience to natural disasters through our continued climate action and new tools such as the Famine Action Mechanism, which uses artificial intelligence to help predict and respond earlier to famines. And finally, we will focus extensively on helping countries invest more and more effectively in their people. Our recent research shows that human capital is the largest component of global wealth. It's also one of the best investments a country can make, what we call a no-regrets investment. No matter what happens in the future, investments that improve outcomes in health and education will pay dividends. Last spring, we talked about the launch of the Human Capital Project. We're helping countries understand the impact of underinvestment in people. Later this week, we'll be launching a new Human Capital Index, a comprehensive international metric that I hope will change the conversation about investing in people. Our goal is to create the political space for national leaders to prioritize human capital investments. The index will quantify the contribution of health and education to the productivity and income levels of the next generation. Countries can use it to assess how much income they are giving up because of human capital gaps and gauge how much faster they can turn these losses into gains by strengthening human capital outcomes. Our new World Development Report this year focuses on the changing nature of work. We're releasing it on Thursday, and it spells out clearly what countries lose when they don't prepare workforces to compete in today's global economy, and what will happen if they don't prepare their people for the more highly skilled jobs of the future. If countries don't make these critical investments with a fierce sense of urgency, they'll be left behind. The pace of innovation is accelerating, and it's going to get harder and harder to catch up. We can learn many lessons from countries that have done these kinds of investments well. I was born in South Korea when the country was still devastated by the Korean War, and by the way, for the first 4 years of my life, the World Bank refused to provide loans for South Korea because they thought that the economy at the time suggested that they would never be able to pay it back. At that time, the literacy rate was 23%. The World Bank called it a basket case, at least colloquially, and when they did finally come around to agreeing to provide loans, the first was for a railroad, and the second was for education. Then Korea kept investing in education. Today, the literacy rate is nearly 98%. In the past 37 years, Korea's GDP has increased 47-fold versus a 13-fold increase in the United States. Or Singapore, the top performer on the PISA test, the Program on International Student Assessment, and among the highest performers on the Human Capital Index. Singapore is still making investments in people a national priority. In his 2017 National Day address, Prime Minister Lee said the goal was to, quote, build our future so that Singaporeans can start right, stay healthy, and live smart at every age. Here in Indonesia, we're working hand in hand with the government to address the high stunting rate, estimated at 36% of children under the age of 5, or almost 9 million children. The country has made a strong commitment to accelerate the fight against childhood stunting, building on lessons from around the world, including those of Peru, which cut its stunting rate by half in just 7 years. Indonesia is helping pregnant mothers and children under the age of 2 receive access to key services such as basic immunization and nutritional support. The signs are promising. We're working closely now with close to 30 countries that have come on board with the Human Capital Project. Our collective challenge is to turn commitment into meaningful change for the countries and constituencies you represent, and to inspire and set the standard for others around the world to follow. Next year marks another milestone on our journey to end extreme poverty when we kick off the 19th replenishment of IDA, our fund for the poorest 75 countries. IDA will be central to the human capital agenda. We've always appreciated your support for multilateralism, for development, and for our efforts to end poverty all over the world. And we'll be counting on your continued support as we continue our work for years to come. I hope you'll come away from the high-level parliamentary meeting inspired to take action on these critical investments. If you do, you'll help play a historic part in moving our planet toward greater stability, security, and prosperity today and for the next generation. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Kim. Madam Lagarde, thank you.
Thank you very much. Selamat pagi. Pak Jeremy, Ibu Alpha, Pak Jim. It's very nice to be here with you again at the time of the annual meeting. And we at the IMF, we completely concur with the points that Jim has just been making, the real critical importance of human capital. And I would just like to make 2 points. One is, why is it of concern to every one of us around the table? Because you represent countries that are at different levels of development. And it's a concern for the low-income countries and the developing countries because clearly, generally, their development coincides as well with a very large proportion of young people. You have a lot of youth coming to education, coming to jobs. And they need, for the future and for the future of your country, they need that human capital to be developed. Second, it matters for all economies because the new technologies are changing the workplace. I see that one of you has published this beautiful future of work for the people we serve. Well, it is going to be slightly different because technology is going to bring about many changes. And for that, we need to be prepared, and human capital is the key. The third reason why all of us are concerned is that it takes money. It doesn't only take money. It takes excellence, it takes perseverance, it takes all of that, but it takes money. And money is going to come from multiple sources, but all have to contribute. And by that I mean it's going to be a question of sourcing from the public sector. That's where you all come in when you vote a budget, when you decide on a law. But it also will require money from the private sector, because none of the public sector funding will be sufficient to actually respond to the urgency of the needs, particularly in low-income and developing countries. So it's for all, public and private. And in the public sector, it will require, if we look at the low-income and developing countries, it will require a better focus on domestic revenue mobilization. I would like to mention Indonesia, which has made significant progress in domestic revenue mobilization recently, and that is really a good and hopefully continuous development. It will require aid, support by the donor countries, and there are some around the table. They will continue to be needed. There are some countries that are doing an enormous effort to help others, and it will require the funding from the private sector as well. So different sources, different level of interventions, but it's a matter for all of us. So what can the IMF do about it? We do not have the same skill set, jurisdiction, and capacity as the World Bank, and we operate at the macroeconomic level. Yet, when we use our fiscal capacity to identify how much will it cost to get to that development stage, to finance human capital, we can help. And we develop that in actual, not just advice, but how does it effectively work? How can we help you measure it? How can we help you build the capacity? And how can we provide the technical assistance to that end? In program countries, we try to carve out those areas that will actually at least maintain, if not increase, the budget for education in particular. Second, we are also exploring areas which, in my personal view, and I think now in the view of the IMF, and I'm sure that Jim would agree with me, empowering women and making sure that they have access to those funds, because they will be spending that money on education, not on other things. Critically important, and we do a lot of work now in relation to women's empowerment and their contribution to the workplace and their access to finance in particular. And the third area where we are clearly doing work as well is in the area of corruption, because we know too well that money diverted to uncertain directions are going to fuel disenfranchising, dissatisfaction, fear of the future, and certainly big lack of trust. And we believe that that also contributes to a better platform from which young people will continue to be educated. I will close with one thing. It's not just about young people. I think this human capital, we can all continuously develop it. And if we learn anything about the future of work for the part that we have done, we certainly come to the conclusion that everybody has to continuously stay up to date and try to be ahead of the curve when it comes to technological development. And I see too many areas where women in particular are going to be affected by technological breakthrough, where they have not been the beneficiary of training and lifelong training. So with that, I will close my remark and be happy to take questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed, Christine. And one way in which we can connect young people with ourselves, I find with my children, which is that they are the ones who teach me now. So lifelong learning includes includes our children teaching us about technology, I find. Now, what we're going to do is, if I could ask anybody who wants to ask a question to put their name upright, then I'll know, and you don't have to keep on putting your hand up. I'm going to start with our Vice President, Olfa, and then we'll take 5 questions at once. Yeah.
Thank you, Jeremy. It's just a comment and maybe question, and I'd like to focus on 3 points. Girls, women, and technology. How to offer to girls same opportunities than boys. Quality of education, access to digital, and healthcare, early childhood. The second is about women. How to raise the participation of women at labor market. How to give to women opportunity to fund their own project, to be entrepreneur, to be superwomen somewhere. Empower women in politics. Give women the equality inheritance in some countries, essentially in MENA. And third, digital transformation is the revolution, is the change of the area, is the way how people change their way to govern, to do business, to learn, to communicate, how to use this tool to give more transparency for the financing of development, how to make it inclusive, and how to use it for the accountability for our citizens, the people that we serve. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ulfa. A colleague from Indonesia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Jeremy, right? Is it Jeremy? Thank you. My name is Bara Hasibuan. I'm a member of the Indonesian Parliament. My question is addressed to Dr. Kim. And when President Obama announced that you would be proposed to take over the directorship of the World Bank, I was actually surprised. You know, given your background, and then at that time you were president of Dartmouth University, and then you are actually a medical doctor, so you were pretty. It was a highly unorthodox choice, but I think you've done a great job at the helm of the bank, and then I'd like to commend you for putting human capital as a focus in these annual meetings, and also Dr. Lagarde. My question is, you know, Indonesia, we actually mandated by the Constitution to allocate 20% of our national budget for education. But ironically, our human capital index is still pretty low. I think it's still pretty, even among the ASEAN, the Southeast Asian countries, I think we rank 7 out of 10 countries total in ASEAN. So I think we need more assistance from the bank in finding ways on how to allocate, you know, education budget more effectively. We understand, you know, we are the largest country in ASEAN, but ironically, human capital index is still pretty low. And of course, this is the 21st century, it's very competitive. The only way for a nation or a country to be able to compete effectively is for that country or a nation to have a strong human capital. And I think we in Indonesia, we understand that. And we in the parliament, I happen to sit on the committee in the parliament that oversees research and technology. And again, ironically, even though we have 20% allocation for education in our budget, we don't spend enough on research and technology. Spending vis-a-vis as a relative to our GDP is only about 0.2% for research and technology. That's very, very low compared to Singapore, Malaysia. I think Singapore spends about close to 3%. Malaysia, I think, is the same. Vietnam is higher. So we need more assistance for the bank. And I think, and also from the IMF for that matter. And then, as you know, I think our current government is pretty, would actually welcome further assistance for the bank. We don't have that much resistance when it comes to continuing our cooperation with the bank. And I think we need to shift the focus. So human development would be the focus for the next few years. And I think the parliament is ready. Rest assured that the Indonesian parliament is also committed to assisting the Indonesian government to find ways, to find practical measures on how we can improve our human capital. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. A colleague from Morocco. Yeah, we will come back. I'm just trying to take a colleague from Morocco.
Bonjour, Madame Lagarde. Excuse me.
Collègue, femme ou homme?
أمشي.
Vas-y.
Bonjour, Madame Lagarde.
Good morning,
Good
Madam
morning,
Lagarde.
Mr. Kim. One of the levers to use to invest in human capital is by investing in education. And investing in education is very costly. In order to prepare for the new skills. But facing now the real speed of the world, these new skills will be overtaken soon, which is a very big issue. I want to hear you in this issue. The fast changing we are continually changing in this area. Thank you.
Thank you. And sorry, our colleague, Madam from Morocco.
Merci Madame Lagarde. Vous avez tablé
Madame Lagarde.
sur le développement,
You talked about
sur l'éthique pour justement développer
development
et
and the
booster
special
le
ways to
capital
development
humain.
and to boost human capital.
Il est peut-être vrai pour les jeunes,
And
mais
I
qu'en
think this is
est-il pour les
particularly
jeunes femmes
possible for young
et les
people,
petites filles
but
qui
we'd
sont
like to know more about
analphabètes,
young women and girls
notamment pour
who
les
are
pays en voie de
illiterate, and
développement.
particularly in developing countries. Thank you.
Thank you. And then finally, Vjosa from Kosovo.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to hear from you again. We've recently, with the help of the Parliamentary Network, established the Global Young MP Initiative, and we're really happy to be joined by Mr. JP in our conversations to set forward the priorities. Now, what we're trying to do is work with those priorities in our home countries, with the World Bank Office and with the IMF. So in Kosovo, we have this idea of establishing a Kosovo coalition for youth employment, because governments change so fast, parliaments change, and we need to establish sustainability in the policies that support youth employment. So the idea is to involve the parliament, the government, and the private sector all together, no matter which political party and what background they come from, in order to work with these sustainable policies for human capital and especially youth jobs. So the question is, in order to achieve this sustainability, even when governments change, can we count on the support of the World Bank and the IMF?
Who would like to go first on that?
Thank you. Thank you very much to all of you. Alpha, you sort of blended three things that come together. And I'm not going to disclose now a research paper that we're publishing this afternoon, but unfortunately it gives us sort of good news, bad news, and I'll just stay on the surface of it because I don't want to dwell into it. But it shows that, unfortunately, new technologies, combination, let's call it digital for lack of a better encompassing word. Unfortunately, women are more exposed to transformation of their jobs and of their tasks than men. So, you know, that's the bad news. The good news is that we're clearly moving, and all economies, whatever their development, are moving in the direction of service-intensive economies. And in services, there is more space, more openings for women than in the old style of development. So that's the, but it's really bad news, good news, and it means that there has to be a very strong focus on educating, improving, and familiarizing young girls and women to the digital tools and to all its attributes. And it has to start at an early age, because otherwise we'll just lose ground big way. Indonesia, I think I'll leave that one to you, Jim. It was more the new skills that are becoming obsolete. You know, when you listen to, I'm not the expert, and I don't think the IMF can claim top expertise, but I'm curious, so I read as much as I can. And when you read what has been written by some of those top-notch professors, whether it's MIT or whether it's Stanford, whether it's all those places where they're really looking deep and hard into what the new skill sets will be, because they want to be able to provide those skills to students. It's fascinating that they don't all come out to say, you have to learn coding. They say, yeah, we will need engineers that do coding, but not the entire workforce, whatever the levels, has to do, a computer engineer who is capable of coding. And they say that the quality of education, the ability to question, the ability to to adjust, the ability to blend different fields together is actually probably more important than a very deep down teaching and learning in a particular field that is fashionable today, or not fashionable, but that is en vogue at the moment. So that I'm just offering that because I'm not the top-notch expert. For girls, I think it goes. Je vais vous répondre en français. Vous m'avez interrogé en français. C'est un peu la réponse que j'ai donnée tout à l'heure à Alpha, mais je crois que dans tous les pays, il faut absolument aussi éliminer les discriminations dans le domaine juridique. Et Alpha a parlé tout à l'heure de la loi sur l'héritage, qui est évidemment une question fondamentale en Tunisie et sur laquelle je crois que le monde entier voudrait applaudir des deux mains et soutenir la Tunisie dans son effort d'égalité entre les filles et les garçons lors du décès des parents. Mais dans à peu près 90% des pays membres du FMI et de la Banque mondiale, on a des discriminations légales, soit dans la Constitution, soit dans le système de loi, qui s'exercent à l'encontre des jeunes filles, à l'encontre des femmes. Donc ça, il faut arriver à éliminer ça. Il ne faut pas le faire de manière menaçante, simplement parce que ça fait du sens moral, ça fait du sens économique. Ça, c'est la deuxième recherche qu'on publie cet après-midi. Les bénéfices économiques en termes de gains de croissance, de productivité, sont absolument évidents et étaient probablement jusqu'à présent sous-estimés. Donc ça, c'est un argument, à mon avis, très important. Je veux dire, thank goodness you're doing that and you're bringing young people into this equation, because it's vital that all be included, and they are the ones who will need the human capital. They are the ones who should also take a hold of their collective destiny and also embrace political and activist futures. So I'm delighted that you're doing that.
Okay. So let me just start with going back to what Christine said about all the different ways that you can finance this new investment in human capital. I think this is really important. Aid will continue to be important, as she said, but I think aid is going to have to be much more strategic. It's not always going to be grant-based. Some of the aid, I think, will be used to leverage, our loans, and so that you'll have lower interest loans, but the volume will be more appropriate to the challenge. Domestic resource mobilization is critical. Private sector finance is critical. Another thing that we've talked about a lot is getting rid of very inefficient and polluting subsidies. Fossil fuel subsidies is one, but also agricultural subsidies are often not focused on the right thing, and the benefits often go to the middlemen, and often with political connections, as opposed to going to the poorest farmers. So we think that there's going to be many different ways of finding the resources to invest in people. And let me just go first to the Kosovo. How will we maintain this? That's the whole idea of doing the index, because there's no new government that will be able to avoid the ranking that will continue to come out. And I hope that political campaigns are run on promises that they'll invest more and more effectively in people. Now, Christine said most of the things that I would say, but the digital transition for women is important. But the other thing that's so interesting is that the skills that will be needed, problem solving, reasoning, self-efficacy, working together in teams, often women are a lot better at that than men are. And so there could be an advantage in the jobs of the future. But there will be a whole new set of skills. And again, good news, bad news here. A lot of the teachers currently in the low and lower middle income countries especially don't have those skills, but those skills are now increasingly online. And I was just in San Francisco twice in the last 3 weeks to meet with different groups to try to find out what innovations are happening. And both in higher education and in elementary to K-12 education, there have been tremendous innovations. And so we feel that you can bring school systems up to speed much more quickly than before. The 20% issue is something I've talked a lot with Srimiliani about. Why, if we spend such a high percentage of the budget, which actually is not a huge percentage of GDP, I have to tell, excuse me? Yes, but it's not a huge proportion of GDP, right? Korea spends a huge proportion of GDP, much more than Indonesia, and so I don't think you're spending too much. but I do think that you're not getting the outcomes that you want. The thing about the Human Capital Index is you cannot, quote unquote, game the system by pledging more money. You actually have to get better outcomes. So you have to get better what we call learning adjusted year of schooling outcomes. You have to reduce your stunting rate. You have to reduce childhood mortality. You have to actually get better numbers. And so we have a way of doing that. It's called the Program for Results, where we only provide financing to you if you get better results. And then you can turn around and say to your ministries, all right, you'll get the money, but only after you show the results. That has worked extremely well in country after country. So again, and you'll see it here. We have innovators in education. We're spending a whole day, and they're going to be here in Bali showing what they can do. I think the new model is that no matter where your teachers are, if you get the best teachers in the world on your tablet computers in your native language, if you get the best teachers translated into your native language, then not only do the students learn, but the teachers learn over the course of a year. The teachers actually get better. And over the course of a year, if they can master the curriculum that they're teaching, that's actually quite good. Because in many African countries, and I would guess in Indonesia as well, many of the teachers who are teaching could not pass a competency exam for the materials they're actually teaching. Unfortunately, that's what we found. So a huge task, but with technology, I think very much doable. And again, we'll be very happy to help with finding ways of financing it, because if you got rid of the inefficient subsidies, if you did things like tobacco taxes, if you reduce corruption, there's going to be enough money to finance it. Finally, on girls and women, again, I think just every economic study that has ever been, almost every single one has shown that investing in girls is, especially in girls' education, is one of the best investments you can make. But the point we're making from the Human Capital Index is it has to start with a pregnant woman. It's the first 1,000 days. If you lose neuronal connections, the connections in your brain, because children are stunted in the first 1,000 days, you do not make it up. Right? And so the countries that are looking at 35 to 40% childhood stunting, I fear that that percentage, that group of young people, when they become adults, are going to be the source of instability in society. So it's an urgent task, but I think that the program you've put together in Indonesia has tremendous potential, because it's one of the best organized, one of the most ambitious programs I've seen, and we're going to watch, and I think we can see dramatic drops in childhood stunting, improvements in early childhood development in the very near future, because you've committed to it so strongly.
Thank you very much indeed. We've got 9 more people indicating questions, so I just see another 10. I'm going to try and get through everybody, but it does mean that I can't take any more, I'm afraid, because otherwise we'll run out of time. We have to have very short questions, please, and I'll take them in batches of 5, or I may even go longer than that. Yes, okay. Indonesia.
Okay. Thank you. Good morning. I think I have a question to Dr. Kim. Yesterday we've discussed about the creating jobs for young people. As we are aware that the new industrial revolution, the economy 4.0 creates even higher entry barrier for younger people to enter job with very limited skills. So I think it is very essential to establish stronger entrepreneurship skills within the younger generation, especially developing economies such as Indonesia. My question is to Dr. Kim is, could you please sort of like update us or like explain to us sort of, is there any particular specific programs from World Bank Group in tackling these issues in regards to entrepreneurship in developing countries? Thank you.
Thank you, Indonesia.
Thank you, Chairman. I want to say thank you to Madam Lagarde. You are visiting and coming to the earthquake disaster in the Lombok. I appreciate for this. Also to Mr. Kim. I have a question for the IMF about what the IMF effort to reduce trade war between US and China, because this trade war have a very seriously impact to the global economic situation, also to us. We have volatility in our currency, And that is, in the same time, we must do any effort to reduce poverty and to our national education and to our healthcare and others. In the same time, we have many variables in the economics to reduce and to make our become the emerging country. Indonesia is makes to go forward with some internal situation, but in the same time, the global situation is more and uprising in the uncertainty. That is the problem. Also, what the global effort to reduce this? It is the global situation. It is not between the US and China only. Yes, it is very serious. On Dr. Kim, I have a question about the digitalization economy. You know, the transforming from the traditional economic to digitalization in Indonesia have to also the one impact when the very big capital and very huge capital is coming to foreign country, and the acquisition the local inventor and makes our local unicorn digital is become owned by the foreign investor. It is the problem for us. What the World Bank effort about it? Because it is about you know, the globalization is in the transforming economic is problem for us also.
Thank you very much.
Without global effort to reduce this situation. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. I really appreciate the questions from Indonesia, and they're our hosts, so we need to hear them. But could we just have very quick questions? No, I'm only going to take people I'm afraid of already. Jordan, please. Jordan, please.
Good morning, and thanks for everybody here in the hall. I am talking about the women participation. Yesterday we heard a session called Women's Participation in Economic Growth. But me personally, I do believe that growth, the economic growth depends on women participation. For that, in order to enhance the economic participation of women, I would like to recommend the World Bank and IMF to encourage our governments to develop and policies based on international labor standards. This approach will encourage women to engage the labor market. Thank you.
Thank you. Chris from the UK, please.
Good morning, and thank you for the positive opening remarks from both Christine Lagarde and Jim Kim. I wanted to ask a broad question, which is, given that we're facing serious global challenges from climate change, mass migration, tax evasion, and of course the digital economy, is both the World Bank and the IMF's mandate currently suitable for those challenges? And if not, what would you like to see change?
Thank you. From Malaysia, please.
Okay, thank you very much. Empowering women through jobs in digital economy is highly applauded, and however, we at one point we are talking about empowering women through digital for in terms of entrepreneurship, but at the same time we are talking about the connectivity gap, which is still huge. For example, in certain areas, rural areas like Malaysia, we still have huge connectivity gap. So what's your views on this, so that is going to be balanced? Thank you.
Thank you. And finally, for this round, Switzerland, please.
Thank you to both Christine Lagarde and Dr. Kim for clear words. My question, which is probably more to the World Bank, your counterparts are governments. In the majority of countries, governments are functional, well-organized, able to represent the interests of the citizens. But there are also the other ones, states in fragile context or with civil wars. How can you cooperate with non-government actors, or alternatively, on a case-to-case basis, with NGOs, the private sector, or organizations having access to alternate stakeholders like the International Committee of the Red Cross? Thank you.
Thank you very much. So creating jobs for young people. Let me talk specifically about that. So for example, there are some really exciting models in various parts of the world. One of them is in China, where Alibaba, Tencent, and other platforms have made access to capital, access to markets, access to marketing, procurement, even accounting, all available online. And my understanding is that Alibaba is now working in Indonesia, or is beginning to, and is doing it with an Indonesian company. So Alibaba will not end up owning all these companies. They'll be providing some of the capital, but the ownership should be with the local entrepreneurs, as it has been in China. Alibaba's created huge numbers of jobs with the creation of small and medium enterprises, and it has, in a way, I would say, democratized access to capital. Now, the problem with foreign direct investment in Indonesia has a lot to do with just how thin the capital markets here are here in Indonesia. You all know the story very well. Much of the capital is sitting in other places like Singapore. And so building the depth of the capital markets in Indonesia so that you can, for example, begin to see an Indonesian-based venture capital industry, that would be great, but it's not there yet. It's not there yet. And so my own guess is that there are many young people in Indonesia who would love to have access to capital, access to markets, and access to all the other support that they're providing online. And my suggestion is to look at the possibility of working with these, not just Chinese, but there are many other companies around the world that are trying to do this. Now, another example that I want to give is there's a really wonderful company that I just met called Andela, A-N-D-E-L-A. And what they do is they provide direct training to young people who, sometimes with a high school education, sometimes with a college education, on coding. And for about $10,000, they can fully train young people, and they've trained 20,000 already in Africa. And what's happened is that the companies have been more than happy to pay the cost, because that $10,000 training local African students has been much more cost effective than trying to bring in those skills from elsewhere. So again, I think they'll be here. I'm not sure that they'll be here, but I think they'll be here in Bali. There are so many possibilities, and so we would be very happy to work directly with you, our team, to provide you the names, the companies that are doing these kinds of things. The other thing I want to bring to the table is that we've just started something called the Women's Entrepreneurship Financing Initiative that's specifically focused on providing venture capital support to women entrepreneurs. We've raised $350 million, but that should translate into $3 or $4 billion at least in financing for women entrepreneurs, and we're looking in all the developing countries for good candidates. On the connectivity gap, it unfortunately persists. On the latest Findex, where we look at access to financial services, the gap between men and women has remained at about 8 or 9%, and so we're gonna explicitly focus on this. But I think that one of the major efforts that we have to engage in over the next, at least 5 to 10 years is getting broadband access to everyone. And the technology and the market forces are such that we think that could happen fairly quickly, but we are very focused on making sure that in everything we do, in terms of just access to broadband or access to financial services, that we focus specifically on the gender gap. We've made that a very high priority. Let me just end by saying no, 2 questions, right? The mandate. So I think what you'll see is that both Christine and I have expanded the mandates of our organizations. Christine has talked about gender inequality, climate change, inequality in general, and that has not been what managing directors of the IMF have done before. We've taken on refugee situations, we've taken on pandemics, but we've done it in the way that we can do it. We've done it with the tools we have. And so, for example, for pandemics, we're not first responders, but we created a financial instrument that provides immediate financing. For the famine, we're not, again, the first responders, but we're using artificial intelligence so that we can move our financing earlier so that we can stop pandemics. On climate change, we went from very little work on climate change to now 32% of our overall portfolio has some climate benefits. And so it's not so much that we've changed fundamentally our mandate, it's that we've been trying to be creative so that what the tools we do have can be applied more effectively to tackle those problems. And in terms of counterparts, you know, a third of our investments this year were in the private sector. So we have a deep relationship with the private sector. And also, Christine and I will be hosting the CSO forum. Believe me, we're very engaged with non-governmental organizations and CSOs. And one of the things we do is to have, is we're moving toward 100% beneficiary feedback. In other words, we're trying to, for every single project that we do, have the beneficiaries themselves able to tell us how they're experiencing those projects. And a lot of that comes through the CSOs. And so from everything from our environmental and social framework to the documents that we produce, believe me, the conversation between us and the civil society organizations is constant and very intense.
Very briefly, Jeremy, and I want to address your question in particular on trade. To tell you that we do everything we can. And by that I mean either by ourselves or jointly with the bank and the World Trade Organization, we try to produce the best analytical work that we can to demonstrate the upside of trade and how much it has contributed to productivity, to innovation, over the last decades, brought people out of poverty, improved the quality of consumption, reduced prices. That's on the upside. On the downside, we're also trying to identify what needs to be fixed, not broken, but fixed. How the WTO must modernize in order to include those areas that are contentious at the moment, not with a view with pointing fingers, not with a view with discriminating, but with a view to improving the system, and in particular open it to the service industry, where the level of barriers is still in the range of 40%, and where the gains resulting from a reduction of those tariff barriers would be huge. So identifying the upside and the downside of trade with honest, solid analytical work is the first thing that we do. And we will be presenting tomorrow, together with Jim and with Roberto Azevedo and with also the OECD, that research, and we will be having a whole day session on trade and how trade actually is essential. The second thing we do is identify the spillover impact of what is happening at the moment and calling for de-escalation of the tensions on trade, because if it continues, it will definitely have an impact on growth, not just for the contenders of that discussions, but also for many other countries around the world because of the supply chains, because of the interconnections, because of the FDIs, and because of the fact that we are one trade planet in the main. So we are going to continue doing that, and we also try to offer a forum for those reformers of goodwill who have views as to how it could change. You know, the European Union has produced a few proposals. Canada is putting proposals on the table also to better address the downsides. But the downsides are not only at the international level where we try to operate, it's also at the local level. You know, if people feel excluded, if people see their jobs go because of the dislocation of manufacturing activities in particular, it requires local policies as well as the international approach. So I think it's a critical area where local domestic policies have to impact, and where the international community has to be focused on both the benefits and the deficiencies that need to be addressed. But certainly count on me. I'm a former trade secretary for France, and I've been involved in a lot of those trade discussions. It is hard. It is laborious. It is tidy in a way. You have to look at all those lines one by one and identify where there are benefits, where there are costs, where it has to go down. I hope we get back on a track of debate, dialogue, and progress rather than escalation of tensions between the nations, because there's no question that it would impact the two, but it would impact also many other countries. And Indonesia is a case in point that would be affected if that was the case. I think I agree with what Jim has said. I'm not going to add. Maybe one regret in terms of are we, sort of fit for purpose in a way, in order to procure stability and that prosperity which is called for in our mandate. One regret that I have is that sometimes I wish we had more traction, because I know that what we're saying makes sense, is grounded in analytical work, in empirical research, and yet because of the point that the parliamentarian from Kosovo identified, because the government changes. And as Juncker put it, he said, well, we know what to do, we just don't know whether we are going to be re-elected if we do it. And traction is something that we generally have in program countries, where we say, okay, maybe your government will change, but we want commitment from the opposition that you are going to abide by those principles. But other than programs, you're really counting on the goodwill and the honesty and the understanding of those member countries.
Thank you. What I'm going to do now, because we're pretty much running out of time, is I'm going to go around all the people who've got questions. We probably won't be able to get answers, but at least we can note the questions, and you will have heard them, and then we can perhaps get some written information after. So please, very, very short questions. Nepal, please.
Thank you. For human capital development, we all agree that health and education are very important. They are very important public expenditure items, but the public funds not sufficient. There are large number of private providers in many countries, which do invest much more than the public sector investors in health and education. But without good regulatory framework, they have incentives to engage in scheme the cream behavior. But also we know that regulatory mechanisms are not very good. Rent-seeking behavior is there. And with this, do you not think for IMF and the World Bank, it's important to work, support, and fund so that the private sector providers of these services do work in the best interest of public, but at the same time, the incentive to stay in the business not taken away by state or non-state actors? Thank you.
Thank you. Excellent question. India, please. There's one from India. Yeah, thank you.
I fully support what Nepal says, that we have a situation where structures are collapsing. Financial markets are in a dwindled situation. With the result, we find that in a long-term basis, there is transfer of investable capital from south to the north. And so if we take a long-term view, if we go on counting on private sector without some kind of understanding how the social justice all over the world is going to be done and be sustainable, we will be finding ourselves in difficulty in not too long-term future. Thank you.
Thank you. UK, then Jordan, then Morocco.
Thanks, Jeremy. Dr. Kim, the Human Capital Index strikes me as an incredibly exciting and innovative potential tool. How will you maximize its impact, in particular working with other organizations like the Global Partnership for Education and also the interaction with the proposed International Finance Facility for Education?
Thanks, Stephen. Jordan, please.
Thank you, Mr. Kim and Madame Lagarde. It's a general question, but it also addresses the same topic here. In many countries, and Jordan is one of them, that follows the dictates of the IMF set the rules and standards, but does not bear the consequences. In many cases, we find that the people have been increasing the tax, and this makes them feel more hard and more harsh life. I think we should look for new ways to increase productivity and improve standards of living in developing countries. And I mean that we should invest in people, as you have mentioned now, not invest in taxing the people. Thank you.
Thank you. Morocco. You had one? Yes.
Bom, j'ai pas une question, juste
It isn't quite
je
a
voudrais
question,
partager une conviction qui est
but
la
I would
vôtre,
like to share a
et qui est
conviction
liée à
of
la
mine, which I
thématique
believe
de
is yours
cette
as
réunion
well,
annuelle
and
relative à
which has
l'investissement en
been
capital humain.
picked up in
Hier, nous
the
avons bien
theme of these
signalé
annual
que
meetings, and we see it in front of
75%
us, investing in
je pense,
human
de la
capital.
richesse
We were
mondiale
saying yesterday that
vient
about
du
60,
capital
70%,
vient des hommes
70%
et des femmes.
of,
Et ça me rappelle un peu
world capital
une
comes from
citation de
human capital, from
grand
men
philosophe
and women.
économiste
And this, of course,
Jean Boudin qui
harks back
disait au
to Jean
XVIe
Boudin's
siècle, il n'est
premise
de richesse que d'hommes.
back in the 16th century,
Et je
who
voudrais
said
partager avec
that
vous
the
aussi
only true
une
wealth
définition du développement.
is in
Le développement,
mankind. And
c'est
so,
le développement de l'homme,
surely when
bien
we
sûr
speak
avec
of
un grand
development,
H,
what
par
we
l'homme
know
et
we
pour
mean
l'homme.
is
Merci.
development that is
Merci.
for mankind
Malawi,
and
please.
by mankind. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Dr. Clement Chiwaya, and I am a Deputy Speaker in Malawi. My question is directed to both of you. UN experts believe that we have up to 2030 to pretty much avert catastrophic global warming. What is going to be World Bank and IMF in addressing this, considering that this would as well affect negatively strides that we have made or achieved so far in human capital investment? Thank you.
Thank you. Malaysia.
Thank you, Dr. Kim and Madam Lagarde. Just a very simple question to add on, to echo what my colleague from Nepal has mentioned earlier, especially to Dr. Kim. I think the country strategy on developing human capital varies, especially on the budget proposition. What is the workable model to ensure that both important elements, education and health, can be put into the national budget? Because somehow or other there are certain countries that there are clear imbalance, which I don't think it will come up with a proper human capital program. Thank you.
Thank you. Morocco.
Thank you very much. My question is very simple with regard to investing in human capital. I think the approach that you are adopting is a system-based approach, systemic approach. In most of the countries that we represent around the table, low-income countries, but also middle-income countries, we have like a huge problem with youth aged between 20 and 35, and those youth are outside the system, they are antisocial, they are disenfranchised, they are disillusioned. How will this kind of systemic approach target those youth and then capture them? Will the lifelong learning be able to do that? And I think that's one of the most challenging things that we are facing in our countries. Thank you.
And finally, Liam from the UK.
Thanks. Just an observation really on putting the book together, which is that I think we've got a lot of work to do creating a project hope for the future of automation, because I think voters do sense that they're not living in an era of change, they are living in a change of era, but they're not confident that they're going to do well in the future. And the investments that we all know are needed in human capital, both in the education system but also in lifelong learning systems, aren't cheap, they're very expensive, and they're needed at a time when debt levels, as you pointed out this week, are already extremely high. And traditional taxes, like payroll taxes, are under tremendous pressure. And so I guess I would urge you really to push as hard as you can on the work on new forms of tax, whether that's wealth tax, whether it's other forms of tax, in order to strengthen states' fiscal base for this kind of investment. And second, just a plea really to continue the work on market concentration, which the Inclusive Growth team has done. I think the work that Romain Duval has led in particular is incredibly important at a time of rising market concentration, and platform capitalism is a challenge for many of us. And so without a more entrepreneurial environment and without stronger tax bases, we're going to find this project hope very difficult to put together.
And sorry, finally, I didn't, forgot my friend, Mr. C.
Mr. C, yeah. I would like to raise the question to both of you. I did it about 2 years ago about Senegal having oil and gas, how to make it a blessing and not a curse. And 3 years later, I am raising the same question because the context is very different. We are in electoral drive, and there are a lot of violence anticipation. What kind of advice, again, can you give us in order to go through this period in a very peaceful country, who so far we have been to election without any big problem, but this time is very, very serious. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And okay, very finally, Bangladesh, and then if a brief comment from each.
Thank you. In our experience in Bangladesh, to raise human capital, we find that some bottlenecks do exist on the way of transferring technology from the developed to the developing. And also, some bottlenecks that stand on the way of mobility of labor from the developing to the developed. Do the IMF, especially the World Bank, have any program to remove these bottlenecks on the way of transfer of technology from the developed to the developing, and also facilitating more mobility of labor from the developing to the developed? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Because our the guests have already gone over the time, we're very grateful to that. What I'll ask is if they could each make a brief comment on maybe one or two of the issues, and then if everybody who has got a question which hasn't been answered could email it to the Parliamentary Network, we'll make sure we get written responses later to those. So perhaps I could start with Madame Lagarde and then Dr. Kim to finish.
Well, thank you so much. Maybe, yeah, sending your question by email is good, but I think that our excellent team has been taking note of your unanswered question. Just a couple of points that I would like to make by way of closing. Number one, the focus on education is vital for the development. The education of women is even more vital for development, and all actors have to be engaged in order to address those issues. If we fail to do that, it's not going to be a very, very happy next meetings that we have in 10 years' time. Not that any of us will be here, but we should care about what we are doing today for our successors in 10 years' time. Second point, to the point you just mentioned about oil. Oil and gas, curse or blessing. 2 points that I would like to make in that respect. Number one, particularly in high prices period as we have it and as we are probably heading towards, it would be very much in the interest of the people and for the legacy that governments are leaving behind, that sovereign funds and the concern for the common goods be best expressed as these windfalls from high oil prices come into budgets that have generally been set up at about $60 per barrel at best. And when the price per barrel goes to 85, 90, that windfall would be best channeled to where it will serve the people. Second, subsidies are on the rise. Subsidies have been very nicely removed at the time when oil prices were down. That was the easy thing to do. Unfortunately, many countries did not lock in a price mechanism that took account of possible price increases. We are now at a price increase level, and there is a tendency and a temptation to reintroduce the subsidies for political purposes, let's face it. It's not for environmental purposes that it's being done, it's for political short-term purposes. And I can understand that, because the people are taking a hit on their consumption. But I think it requires political courage to actually persist and continue to remove the subsidies in order to spend that money that is made available on health, on education, on those issues that will actually matter for the next generations. Thank you.
Let me start by addressing the comment that was made by the gentleman from Morocco about Jean Baudin from the 16th century saying that all investments are good for mankind. 16th century, everybody was poor except a very tiny proportion of people. And so when they talked about humanity, they weren't talking about everybody. They were talking about the royals and the bourgeoisie that lived around them, right? That's not the case anymore, right? Because my parents were one of the few people in Korea at a time when there was 23% literacy who had the opportunity to come to the United States and study and have their aspirations raised. Right now, because everyone will have access to broadband soon enough, the world is changing so quickly because everyone's going to have high aspirations, right? So it's no longer the royals plus the bourgeoisie and everyone else who lived in extreme poverty. Everyone is going to have high aspirations. That's why we're so focused on human capital. Because in that kind of context, if you don't invest in human capital, then you're going to have a lot of people who are going to be able to see how everyone else lives, but then are going to be, they're going to understand also that because they were stunted as children, poor nutrition, poor education, they're essentially locked out from having an opportunity to join that world. That is going to be a huge source of instability going forward. And so what should you do? And the questions for both from India and Nepal are exactly on target. How do we get all the different sectors and the policies organized so that you get better outcomes? And I think the most important thing that we're trying to do with the Human Capital Index is to move the discussion away from input and supply to outcome and demand. And let me explain what I mean. I have been an advocate for more donor financing for health and education for most of my adult life. And I think what's happened is that we've turned this into a situation where there's this phenomenon that you might call moral hazard. In other words, that conversation was so loud that many leaders in developing countries said, yeah, the answer to health and education is for donors to give more. And then when you look at the budgets that the leaders, especially ministers of finance, actually put into health and education, they were tiny. They would use whatever they got, either from IDA, or Fund for the Poorest, or grants, but then on top of that, there'd be very little other investment. And so when we had the problem of human capital as one that the donors had to solve, then we let everyone else off the hook. We're not letting anyone else off the hook. What we hope is that the Human Capital Index will lead to tremendous demand, and not for just budget, demand for outcomes, right? So what will this do, Stephen, what will this do for IFID and GPE? I think what it will do is create tremendous demand, but for outcomes and not inputs, because you cannot gain the system. You've got to improve your test scores, or you're not going to go up the human capital ranking. I hope that all of you will turn the Human Capital Index into a discussion in your countries. What are we doing? Are we prepared for the economy of the future? Because it's coming very, very rapidly. We tried to temper what we're saying about jobs being lost. It's not so much that huge numbers of jobs being lost. The skills required for the jobs that will be there are going to be very, very different. On transfer of capital, there are more Indian billionaires investing in Blackstone and BlackRock away from India than there are wealthy people in sovereign wealth funds investing in India. I don't know the exact number, but I know that that's an issue. And so that's why we have focused all of our efforts in being not just a provider of loans and investment, but a facilitator of the movement of capital back to developing countries. I think that's absolutely the highest priority. And if we're better at bringing capital in the developed world into the developing world for things like infrastructure, that will free up money in the budget for investment in human capital. And I would just say the one final thing. Whatever the oil and gas that Senegal has found, Senegal has been not bad in terms of investing in people, but not nearly enough to prepare it for what the economy will bring in the very near future. And so part of it, as we now look at things like the natural resources curse, we think that the source of that curse could be that you didn't take those receipts and turn it into human capital investments, and that very well could be the key to the future. And let me just say one other thing. As we look at the potential for developing countries, especially in Africa and South Asia, to go down the traditional path of development, agriculture, light manufacturing, heavy industry, we're very concerned that that path may have been closed off, and that the path that seems to be much more open is to go from agriculture or wherever you are directly to entrepreneurship. That seems to be the formula that could very well drive economic growth in the future, and that will require a good policy environment, but more than anything else, very high quality human capital. Thank you.
Can I just thank Dr. Kim and Madame Lagarde very much indeed. They have given an awful lot of their time, and we really appreciate it. So thank you very much. Thank you.